Cooper Carter from Solo a Week, here for G66, and I want to introduce the new version 15 firmware for Fractal audio systems for the Axe-Fx 2 and Axe-Fx 2 XL. Version 15 includes some pretty extensive changes, particularly in the power amp section of the amplifier block, which has been rewritten to bring the models even closer to their real-world counterparts. You're going to find that the amplifiers are punchier, crunchier at higher levels of distortion, have more sustain, are thicker, and in general are just more fun to play. We're going to take a look at some of the new amp models with the new modeling in a couple minutes. Both in the power section and in other areas of the amplifier block, there have been dozens of small changes to the algorithms that govern the circuitry of the amplifier. Check out the release notes for more details on these small changes. This brings me to a good point. Before installing and using the firmware, make sure to read the release notes in full that are included in the firmware zip file. They're going to give you all the details about the changes, beyond what I'm going to touch on in this video. One of my favorite changes that comes from the improvements to the amp block is that the sweet spot on master volume amplifiers has been increased. So whereas on an amp like USA Lead, you might have had usable tone from say 2 to 4 on the master volume, now you're going to find usable tone from say 2 to 6. The benefit of this is not only can you crank the master volume up and get more sustain, but when you turn the master volume up, the distortion is going to be thicker and creamier without creating an enormous booming bass. Keep in mind that because the default amp parameter now has a higher master volume setting for some of these amplifiers, some of your presets may be louder and you're going to need to reduce the volume in the level control in the amplifier block. This brings me to another good point. As with any firmware update that includes a lot of changes to the amplifier block, installing version 15 may change the sound of some of your presets. The easiest way to deal with this is simply to reset the amp block. Before resetting the amplifier block, you might want to write down your settings for depth, presence, master volume, and other relevant controls, so that once you've reset the block, you can reset the controls to what you had before and see how the amp sounds at those settings with the new modeling. Enter the edit screen of the amplifier block and scroll to the amp select page. Scroll off of your amplifier and back onto it. This will reset the advanced parameters of the amp block and a few other controls that have changed. Now, we've always been able to reset amps this way, but version 15 includes a new feature that lets us reset the amps for one preset or allows us to reset the amps in every preset, which is really useful after a firmware upgrade. Just go into the utility menu, scroll to preset, and select either Update Amps Defaults or Update Amps All Presets. Like I said, this feature will obviously make resetting the amp blocks during a major firmware update much easier, but I think a lot of advanced tweakers are going to find this really useful too for when you've done a lot of tweaking on the amp, you've gotten to a place that you don't really like and you need to return back to home quickly. You can just reset the amp with this parameter. One of my favorite parameters in the amplifier block has always been the saturation switch. Turning it on is kind of like kicking the amp into hyperdrive. There's a lot of really rich, thick distortion that's great for leads and sounds really cool on big rock chords too. In versions of firmware previous to this, the switch has acted in an ideal fashion like it would in an idealized amplifier. But now in 15, it's been tweaked so that it models exactly the switch on the real-world amp. But because this is the Axe-Fx 2 and we get pretty much everything we want, there's an idealized setting and an authentic setting. There's obviously an off setting too, so let's see what those three sound like. I'm sure you noticed that the volume on the authentic switch setting was much lower. That's because it's modeling a real-world saturation switch, which dramatically decreases the volume of the amplifier. There's also been a significant change to the presence setting on the amplifiers. Because many of the amps in the Axe-Fx don't actually have a presence setting in the real world, like the double verb or the deluxe verb, these now default to 0. For amplifiers that do have a presence knob in the real world, they default to a typical or appropriate value. You can obviously change it to taste. Another significant change in version 15 that I think a lot of people are going to find very useful is the addition of the output compressor on the amplifier block itself. This allows you to reduce the dynamic range of the amp. To access this setting, enter the amplifier edit screen and scroll to Dynamics. You'll see the output compression knob, which you can use to adjust the amount of compression. In the advanced parameters page, you'll also find the compression threshold setting. Also new in 15 is the addition of the power amp bias knob. This allows you to adjust the symmetry of the amplifier's clipping and increases or decreases the amount of even harmonics you're going to hear in your tone. If all of this sounds a little too technical, try it out for yourself. You'll find that at lower settings, you're going to get a warm, bell-like tone, and as you increase the setting, you're going to find that your tone gets fuzzier. The effect is pretty subtle, even at extreme values, but you can definitely hear it, and you're certainly going to feel it in your playing. Some players, especially people who are using headphones or smaller speakers to play through, might have used the thunk parameter in the previous firmware. You'll notice that it's gone in this one. Because of the improvements to the amplifier modeling, you're not going to miss it. Alright, so let's talk new amps. As with almost every firmware update, there are a couple new amps for us to play around with, and these two I particularly like. The first is the CA Tucana 3, which is based on the lead channel of a Carolan Tucana 3. The second new amp type in firmware 15 is the Junior Blues Fat. It's just like the Junior Blues already in the Axe-Fx, except it has the fat switch turned on. It's based on one of my all-time favorite real-world amplifiers, the Fender Blues Junior. It's super simple and it's super responsive. So let's talk about cabinets. Obviously, with the invention of ultra-res technology, ultra-res cabs are going to factor into all new firmware updates. There were already some included in version 14, but with 15, slots 119 through 132 in the cabinets have been replaced with new ultra-res IRs. I'm going to play the same riff over and over and cycle through some of these new IRs so you guys can hear what they sound like. But the best way to get a feel for them is to install the firmware and try them out yourself. On the effects side of things, version 15 introduces new variable Q EQs. For some users, a variable Q EQ might be more familiar than the constant Q EQ already included in the Axe-Fx. In the graphic EQ, filter, and amplifier block EQ screen, you can now select between variable or constant Qs. In the filter block, simply select peaking 2. In the graphic EQ block, you now have 4 constant and 4 variable options. In the amplifier block, you have 3 constant and 3 variable options. For the users that are more familiar with variable Q, this will give you even more options for dialing in your tone. Firmware 15 also introduces some changes in the chorus and the flanger blocks, so you should pull those up and check them out. As with the amplifier blocks, your sounds may be a little bit different if you use the flanger or the chorus, but with minimal tweaking, you should be able to get back to where you are. You might even find out that it sounds better already and you don't need to change it at all. I hope you've enjoyed this video highlighting some of the major changes and great additions in firmware 15. Since version 14 was already so good, you may not have noticed the changes just listening to this video over computer speakers, but you will as soon as you load firmware 15 into your unit and start playing. You'll hear it and you'll feel it. Again, I highly recommend reading the release notes in full before installing and using the firmware. This has just been a general overview. The release notes go into a lot of detail about what all has changed, and it'll really give you a better sense of everything that's going on in the new firmware. Enjoy and rock out.